Hey there, mathematicians. I'm so excited to be back with you for another practice video. Let's do this. We're going to start by talking about some different ways we can represent decimals using word form, expanded form, models, decimal, and fraction. So we're going to start out with, we know word form. It's 1 34 hundredths. And what I'd like you to do is to be able to think about what the picture would be if we had 1 34 hundredths. So what would the model be like? I want you to either open up Braining Camp or get out some tools and put that on your desk, and then you'll be able to check with me. 1 34 hundredths. Do that now. What do you think it would be? If you, out of your toolbox, got out one whole, because we know this flat equals one whole, 3 longs, 4 tenths, and then 4 units for the 4 hundredths, you would be absolutely correct. This would represent 1 34 hundredths. Now let's try expanded form. Expanded form, remember, is when you take each place value and separate them out and add them together. So, what is the expanded form of 1 34 hundredths? Try writing that on your desk or writing it on your iPad to figure out what the expanded form is. You can kind of see it in this model as well. All right, if you entered 1 whole plus 3 tenths plus 4 hundredths, you would be correct. This would be the correct expanded form for 1 34 hundredths. Notice we've got 1 whole by itself. We've got the 3 tenths here by itself as an addend, and then the 4 hundredths by itself as an addend. Remember, when you're representing hundredths, there's no tenths, so there's going to be a 0 in that tenths place. Now what do you think the decimal would be for this model, this expanded form, and this word form? Think about that and enter it into play. Pause it now. All right, if you entered 1 34 hundredths, you would be absolutely correct. If not, that's okay. Think about how you could change your thinking next time to get it correct. So we've got 1 whole, there's 3 tenths, and then there's 4 hundredths. This is the correct decimal, 1 34 hundredths. Now last thing, think about fraction. What fraction would represent this number? Now, there's a couple different ways you could write this fraction, so you might have more than one answer, and that's okay. You can enter more than one if you'd like to, but one will do as well. We'll check in just a moment. Go ahead and enter it into play. Pause it now. All right. So one possible fraction could be this: 134 100ths. This is an improper fraction, but it does represent 1 34 hundredths because there's 134 hundredths. Another way you could write it is 1 whole and 34 hundredths. These are both acceptable ways to represent 1 34 hundredths. Now, there might have been a different way that you also think works. If you do, you can check with your teacher to see if it really does represent 1 34 hundredths. Thank you so much for your hard work with this part of the video. The next part, we're going to talk about comparing fractions and decimals, but you'll get some practice with this in part 2. For part 3, you're going to get some practice comparing fractions and decimals. So we're going to look at a couple together to get you started, and then you're going to be able to practice this in part 3. So we've got 1/4 here, and we've got 33 hundredths. Now I want to talk to you quickly about 1/4. So if we remember this is 1 whole, we can represent 1/4 by partitioning this whole into fourths. And we can do that by splitting down the center here. Let me do that a little bit better so that it's a straight line. We can partition it right down the center here. And go slower so that it's better. There we go. And then we can partition it in half again, just like we would do with a whole that we're drawing on the table. And when we do that, it creates fourth pieces. And we know that we want 1/4. So we want this section right here. And when we circle that section, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 pieces in that section. And we know each of those is worth 1/100th. So 1/4 is 25 hundredths. And that makes sense with a dollar too. If we think about, we've got $1 and 1/4 of $1 is 25 cents. It's 25 hundredths of $1. So here we've got 1/4, which is also 25 hundredths, and we've got 33 hundredths. Now we can look at the tenths place and see, okay, this one has 2 tenths, but this one has 3 tenths. So that makes this decimal larger. So we need the less than symbol to compare these fractions. I want you to think about these next two on your own. 1 1/2 and 1 35 hundredths. Remember, instead of splitting that whole into quarters, we're just going to split it in half now. What would half of a whole be as a decimal? Think about that. If you need to use a tool, feel free to. And then type into PlayPosit whether you think it's less than, greater than, or equal to. All right, let's look together. I'm going to bring down 1 whole again. And as I do that, we're going to split it in half. So I've got this, and I'm going to split it in half. I'm going to do my best to be right down the center. And now I see that there's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 hundredths here, or 5 tenths. So I know there's 1 whole, and then there's 5 tenths. Now it's easy to compare these decimals. Here I've got 1 whole, here I've got 1 whole, so they're equal so far. Here I have 5 tenths, here I have 3 tenths, so there's more tenths here, so I'm going to need the greater than symbol. Here's 2 more for us to try. 5/4 and 1 200ths. Which symbol belongs here? If you said that you think it is the greater than symbol, you're correct. 5/4 is equal to 1 25 hundredths. This one has more tenths, so it's a larger fraction. Here's 1 more for you to try. 1 2/4 and 3 halves. Which one is larger? Which symbol do I need? If you said equal, you're correct. 1 2/4 is 1 whole, and 5 tenths, because 2/4 equals 5 tenths. And 3 halves is having 3 halves added together, so that would be 1 whole for 2 halves, and then an extra half would be 5 tenths. So these fractions are equivalent. Mathematicians, now you're going to get a chance to practice. In part 2, you're going to get to try with models, finding representations that are equivalent. In part 3, you're going to get to order fractions and decimals from least to greatest. Go ahead and pop down to part 2 now in problem solving, or in this rotation, and you'll be able to practice. Watch the video first, and you will be able to see how it's done. Have fun.